All right, welcome everybody to Pro 150 Business Communications. Tonight, got a few things we want to cover. First of all, we want to do a little bit of reflection on the first half of this class. You're halfway through. Congratulations. After we reflect a little bit on grading so far and what we've accomplished to this point, we'll talk about this week's assignment. Of course, another discussion board module. This week you're going to be putting together a small PowerPoint, just a 2-page PowerPoint, so no big deal. Even though it's only 2 pages, make sure and pack it with as much information as you can. Having said that, don't pack it with so much that it's too busy of a PowerPoint. If you find yourself cramming a lot of information onto 2 pages, make it 3 or 4 or 5 pages. It doesn't have to be a 2-page PowerPoint. It can be as many pages as you want. It just needs to be at least 2 pages. And if you've got a lot of material, then you might want to consider spreading it over a few more pages if needed. So one of the readings from this week is on creating PowerPoints. It'll be a good opportunity for you to read about how your professor in this class is not great at creating PowerPoints. That's not an area of expertise for me. As I was reading that material, I kept thinking, oh, I could do a lot better with my PowerPoints in this class. But hopefully they're okay. They're decent enough, but there are a lot of ways that we can improve our PowerPoints. You know, in one of the articles this week, it's a great article. It's full of things that I can do a lot better on, you know, for my own PowerPoints, even though I've been creating PowerPoints for a long time. A lot of good tips in that article. So we'll talk a little bit about this week's discussion board set of instructions after we talk about, you know, and reflect on what's gone on to this point. And then finally, we'll pick a few things out of the readings for this week and the movies, the video content for this week to review, but not a lot. I've got a few other things I want to get to about effective communication, not from the material this week. So the material is going to be something you can study on your own. Once again, and as always, integrate. If you demonstrate and integrate that information into your discussion board comments, it's much more likely I can give you full credit. Though that video content, those articles, this session, they're all required in a course like this. And so if you can demonstrate that you participated, that you remember anything from this session as far as the material, that you remember anything from the video or article content that's required, that will help you to score potentially better on the weekly discussion board. So thank you for those of you who have been doing that, and I just strongly encourage you to do that going forward if you haven't been, as far as reviewing the session and the material that's required before you get to your discussion board, especially the main post. Okay? All right. So again, talking about effective communication skills tonight, but as I mentioned before, we want to look back a little bit. Week 2, I'm going to go in kind of reverse order on this particular slide, but week 2 has been completely graded. So everything that you've done to this point in the course should be graded, should have a grade on it, should have feedback. And so, you know, you should feel like anything that you've turned into this point has been graded. Now, if you've turned something in late, just be aware, like we talked about in week 1, that might take a little bit longer, but anything you've turned in on time to this point has been graded. And all of week 2 has been graded, anything that was on time from week 2. So what I'm noticing as a general theme, unfortunately, here in the middle of the mod is that many of you are missing some peer responses. Last week was a little bit different instruction that I mentioned during the session and also on one of my announcements last week, that this last week on week 2 called for 3 peer responses in addition to your main post. So some of you got the 2 peer responses that are normally required of a discussion board, but didn't catch that in the instructions that it asked for 3. You're welcome to add another one for some additional points, but some of you are missing all your posts, some of you are missing a handful of your posts, some of you are missing the peer responses. Just use the next few weeks. Obviously, we've only got a few weeks left now to make sure and get caught up on that. Those of you who did participate, well done. That was a great week on the board. I felt like there was a lot of good interaction. Hopefully you felt like that interview was helpful, that you got some good feedback. And maybe, and a few of you mentioned this, but maybe you learned something new about someone that you know very well. So for example, if you interviewed a spouse or a partner, or if you interviewed one of your children or one of your parents, somebody that you've known for many, many years, maybe you learned something new about them through an interview, through asking some questions and kind of getting in a different format with them than the normal routine. And once you get outside of that box and start really listening and trying to interact with them, even though it's for the purpose of a class assignment, right? It still can be a great source of bonding. Any communication in any form, if we're actively listening, like we've talked about before, if we're ready to learn something and to be motivated to do something different, those kinds of things. If we're in that kind of mindset, boy, we can really accomplish a lot through communication, even with people who we feel like we know very well. We feel like we could almost guess what they're going to say, in response to what we ask. Many times we'll be surprised at the answers we get, even from people we know well. So anyway, it was fun to see some of the feedback from some of you that was along those lines, that we learned something new about someone that we love or that someone that we know, and that's always interesting and a great exercise. All right, so for this week, we mentioned or alluded to the fact that we're going to be doing a PowerPoint, a couple slides at least. But that doesn't mean just keep it to 2 slides. Use as many as you want. Make it however you want. The thing that you'll pick up hopefully from the article that talks about making a good PowerPoint or having a good PowerPoint presentation is that there are a lot of different ways to do it. And maybe if you just take 1 or 2 of those tips that assignment puts out there and demonstrate that you actually reviewed that material, you'll be in great shape this week for the discussion board. The other part of the discussion board that is the content that we're going to be putting into the PowerPoint is that it asks you to go to a public place this week and observe people's communications with each other. Now, without being prying or a peeper, I mean, I don't want anybody to get in trouble, right, because they're eavesdropping on somebody. You don't need to be listening to their conversation necessarily, but you do want to watch their conversation, be able to observe their conversation. Easy place to do this would be, in a Walmart. I think it mentions as much, but maybe even just a fast food restaurant, a McDonald's or a coffee shop or something like that, a place where you can sit down, relax for a minute, maybe get a bite to eat or something to drink, and then just be observant of other people without being awkward or staring, right? So hopefully you can do that inconspicuously in a way that doesn't make somebody feel really uncomfortable, like you're observing them, right? But just be able to observe without making them uncomfortable, and find some and jot down some notes about some feedback that you have from their conversations. Now, once again, not about the content of their conversations, but just about what it looked like to watch them communicate with each other, to look for nonverbal cues that were going on between a couple or between 2 people. This is really easy if you're watching, a married couple or a partner, or siblings, for example, because a lot of times they'll be very animated in their expressions. Not that they're speaking loudly, but a lot of times, a lot of the communication that goes on, especially between family members, is that nonverbal form, right? Where we're making faces at each other, we're acting confused, we're acting upset. Those kinds of things are usually we wear right on our face when we're talking to loved ones, perhaps sometimes more with loved ones than people we don't know. So anyway, should be an interesting exercise, should be something that you learn a little bit from, or we wouldn't have you do it. An opportunity to kind of get from or glean from that conversation that you watch or conversations that you watch some of the nonverbal cues that happen and some of the nonverbal things that occur between people. Okay, that's this week's assignment, or at least the instructions for the main part of the discussion board. If possible, get that discussion board main post done by Wednesday at midnight, and make sure, again, that you get those peer responses done so we can give you the additional credit. Just as a reminder, we need 2 different days at least of participation on the board. We need that main post to be pretty substantive, and we want the responses to be pretty thoughtful, right? So sometimes I give 1 or 2 line answers or responses to people's comments, but that's because I'm making a lot more comments each week than most of you are, and I'm facilitating it, right? So don't look at mine and say, oh, he gave a 2-line answer, so that's what we do. Don't do that. Follow the instructions and do what the instructions say, which ask for more substantive responses. Okay. Let's see. I'm reading what you said, John. Just one sec. Yeah. That'd be just fine, John. I'm sure you were able to kind of observe some different things and interactions that were going on. That's an interesting place to do it at a doctor's office because you're going to have maybe some high stress situations, right? So if you can recall some of that, I think that would be just fine to use that. Can you imagine working at a clinic or a doctor's office or an ER or something like that, and just the type of communication? In my mind, and I've never worked in one of those situations, but I have been a consumer or utilizer of those, offices sometimes, the ER, for example. And I've been the crazy person. I had a kidney stone a few years back, and I was the crazy person coming in. Another time, I had a pneumonia, and one of my lungs was just giving me all kinds of pain. One of the sides of my lungs, and so yeah, I was that crazy person that time too. And so yeah, it makes you appreciate somebody that can effectively calm someone and communicate in a very level-headed way, and do a good job like that. Uh, Same kind of thing for dispatcher, right? So somebody who works at a at a 911 call center, they've got to be able to calm somebody down and restate important facts over and over again very clearly, and get right to the most important things that they need, or they'll be ineffective and maybe put people's lives in danger. And so hadn't thought about that before tonight, but there are some occupations that really require a very calm and very good uh, clear communicator, right? So Jonna, you're like me, we're not gonna be working at a hospital anytime soon. Not gonna happen. When I was young, in elementary, I still remember this. I don't remember hardly anything from elementary, but I remember going to a hospital. I was probably 6 or 7, just to go on a field trip, right? To take a look at the hospital. And I distinctly remember getting nauseated by the smell, just the smell of the hospital. Not even, I hadn't even seen anybody. I hadn't even, they didn't take us in to see people, getting care, right? We were just a bunch of little elementary kids, but just the smell of the hospital. And since then, every time I go into a hospital, I wish there just didn't have to be that smell, but it's just a very unique, smell that I just really don't like, and it makes me uncomfortable the moment I smell that. I have been able to get over my nausea, though. I can at least be in a hospital without having a problem, but it still bothers me. It's not a it's not a place I'm excited to be. Let's just say that. So, all right, Jonah. Any questions though about other questions about this week's discussion board? Any of the homework to this point? Any of the coursework to this point? You're doing a great job, Jonah. But anything that you have any? So you've got the question we already answered on the assignment, but anything about past work that you're concerned about, or grades? Okay. So, couple things from this week's readings and videos so there are 2 readings and 2 videos. One of the videos is super short. In fact, I'm sure it's the school just trying to be kind of fun and funny about a situation. I don't know, John, if you got to see that, but it kind of even looks like it's just it is a commercial, right? Yeah, I think we all kind of feel bad, but it wouldn't have been nearly as funny if he wouldn't have been hit by a bat, right, or tasered. That makes the video a lot more fun, even though, obviously if it was us, we wouldn't be laughing. We'd be sad. So, yeah, good commercial. So, but the idea, right, behind it is I think sound, and that is that our communication without the nonverbal side of things can be misconstrued, obviously, and can be taken out of context. And that's a pretty extreme example, but I've had many different times when I've been taken out of context, or I've been misinterpreted, or I've misinterpreted somebody else, just a quick text or an email, or even something that somebody's quickly said to me, and then I found out what they really meant by it, or what they were intending, and it's like, oh, I wish I wouldn't have been so quick to judge what they were saying. And of course, in that commercial, obviously both the cashier and what appears to be his spouse, In hindsight, of course, if they really knew what would have happened, would have regretted making a judgment that fast as well. Although, if you work in a convenience store, you probably have to make quick judgments and just to protect yourself. So anyway, that was kind of a fun video. Not a lot of content, of course, on that. There was another video, and I call it the Linda video. It's basically an advertisement for this this education series, or this class that this lady teaches on communication, it sounds like. And so it's just kind of an intro to her material, and of course she kind of leads up to this the climax, which is, and if you want to know about how to communicate in difficult situations, then you need to buy my class, right, or enroll for my class. And of course we're not going to enroll in that, so we got the kind of the watered down version of communicating and kind of the basics of communicating. And it went over some similar things to what we've already discussed in the class before. Giving versus receiving, I thought was a really good way of thinking about how you're communicating. Whether or not you're the giver of a message or the receiver of a message obviously changes how you should be acting, right? We talked about being an active listener last week and how you respond to people when you're listening. But we didn't really talk about how, if you're the giver of a message, how you want to do that. We did a little bit more of that in week 1 when we talked about how our intent when we're giving a message should be to help someone understand, right? Help there be understanding, help there be something that's memorable, and help there be something that's motivating to change or to create some kind of action. And if we can accomplish that, if we can have understanding and something that's memorable and something that's actionable, then we will have successfully relayed our message, right? Instead of just giving a message, we will have successfully, effectively communicated if we can accomplish those things. So we talked about that, but it's interesting in the context of Linda's video here, where she talks about, okay, be careful that, if we're on the receiving side, we need to act like we're on the receiving side and not like we're trying to give. And of course, we've talked about that before, but it's a different way of thinking about it, a different way of addressing that. She talks about nonverbal communication, of course. She talks about setting a little bit, which I thought was interesting. One of the comments that she makes is, if you're trying to effectively communicate something and you pick a loud venue to do it, then you've made a mistake as the messenger, as the person giving the message, right? So in my world, if I'm trying to have a conversation with somebody about their personal finances as a financial planner, and I pick, a restaurant like Wingers or Wingnuts, or one of these wing restaurants, these bars and pubs where they're pretty loud and they're meant to be loud and fun. And if I pick a place like that to accomplish some business, I've made a mistake, right? That's going to affect my message. It's probably going to reflect on my professionalism as well as an advisor, but it's also going to hamper my ability to communicate. So setting is important. And then, of course, she alludes to tone again, the way we say it. So important, and we've talked about this over and over again, that the way we say it is perhaps more important than what we say, right? All right, so that was Linda's video, some nice tips. Those are just a few of them. I don't know if you saw that one, Jonna. Any feedback that you remember from the Linda video that you'd like to share, or thoughts that you had? Good. I thought, it's always good when you're going to speak about communication, right, to be that you're a good communicator. Of course, she could record and re-record that video until she liked how she communicated her message, but as a general rule, I thought she was a very effective, clear, concise communicator, which was obviously the point, right? Good. Yeah, I thought that was a different way of, it was kind of an aha moment for me, when I was listening to her talk about that, because it's obvious. It's one of these things that's pretty obvious and something we understand in our mind, but maybe you haven't heard it that way, right? Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a little easier to process that when we're writing sometimes. Then there's the helpguide.org article about listening and about communicating. and talks about different tips on how to be an engaged listener. And this reiterates a lot of the things we've already talked about. That we've got to be an engaged listener. I agree, John. I love the lists. I love the bullet points because on almost every one of those, there was at least one or two that I just hadn't thought about the way that they worded it, or it's just kind of a new concept, for me to think about a little bit more. So that's great. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was to assess for ourselves, to analyze for ourselves our stress level, and be able to kind of check ourselves when it comes to the amount of stress associated with our conversation. To the point of the article basically says, we don't have productive communication when there's a high level of stress in our communication. So a lot of us work in high stress work environments where it's not uncommon, for there to be a stressful situation. How do we diffuse that? How do we communicate in spite of that stress? How do we analyze our stress level and whether or not we can even effectively communicate in the moment, and maybe back away from some situations where we might not be able to effectively communicate or listen or understand with somebody else because of our stress level or the stress level of the situation. So I thought that was really a great insight, for us to consider when we're communicating with somebody, is the level of stress that we're feeling can sometimes have a very negative impact on, obviously it can have a very negative impact on how we're communicating. And the easiest one, example for me is, in family relationships, if I feel angst or anxiety about a situation and it pens up and I get more and more frustrated about it, if I can't back myself away from that, obviously my communication is going to be pretty harsh, right? At least it is for me. And so I've got to try to get myself out of that moment, or talk myself, have positive self-talk, that we've talked about before, good communication with myself about how to deal with the situation. Yeah, perfect comment. It goes back to that emotion. And that was one of our articles from last week, was talking about the emotions associated with our conversation. This article kind of took it a little bit different direction, and was talking about how we need to assess the stress level, right? And maybe consider the stress level before we move forward with our communication. Okay, and it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to avoid all stressful situations. It just means that we've got to be able to have a conversation with ourselves, internally, about how we communicate based on the stress level that we're at. Okay. And then this article talked about assertive communication. I thought this was really interesting and great. It talked about how the way that we communicate, once again, not what we say necessarily, but the way we communicate can have an effect on us as communicators, but it also has an effect, obviously, on our listeners, on our audience, based on our confidence in what we're saying, based on how gracious we are, and not necessarily grace in a religious sense, right? But how gracious we are about taking praise, about how we take constructive criticism with grace, how clear we are, and whether or not we're able to say no. And it's also an interesting concept. Many of us have a problem with every one of these things. Our communication doesn't come across very assertive, and because of that, because it's more passive, because it's more reactive, sometimes we're viewed as an ineffective communicator because of that. And it's not a situation where we might be very confident, but the way that we're communicating sometimes can come across lacking confidence, lacking a graciousness that needs to be there, lacking clarity, lacking the ability to stand up for ourselves, say no when we need to say no, and have an honest communication with somebody. And this just comes down to when you feel confident, I feel like you can have more genuineness to what you're saying with somebody, right? Doesn't mean you'll be genuine, doesn't mean you'll be honest, doesn't mean you'll be trustworthy in how you speak and what you say. But I think our confidence level in communicating with other people does allow or enable us to have a high level of genuineness in what we say and how we say it. It allows us to be very self-aware. So just as an example, when we communicate with a spouse, or a partner or someone that we love and have loved and known for a long time and that we trust and that we feel like is non-judgmental, we have a level of confidence with those people many times that exceeds that of when we're talking to somebody we don't know, right? And we don't necessarily trust and we don't know their background and know that they won't be judgmental of us. Well, that confidence allows us with people that we know and appreciate and love, it allows us to be, I think, much more self-aware, much more self-deprecating sometimes, much more confident in how we speak with those people. And that's something that you know already. You know, you didn't need me to communicate that to you. You know that when you're talking to somebody that you feel comfortable with, you're able to say more, you're able to express more. But what's interesting about that is that we're also able to be more honest sometimes, more self-aware, like I say, more honest about challenges and mistakes that we make and things like that than we are with a unknown, crowd. Yeah, and Johnny, you and I have talked about this a little bit in previous weeks about how, the anxiety and the angst that can come up with people that we don't know, in part because we, subconsciously we think that they'll judge us, right, based on what we say. And so we, even if we're not consciously thinking, oh, they're going to judge me, subconsciously, sometimes our brain is hardwired to think that people are going to think the worst of us, right? And that they're going to judge us and that they're going to make assumptions about us that we don't want them to make, because they don't know us. And so it's a little more difficult with people we don't know, right? What has to happen and what we all have to kind of overcome when it comes to dealing with people that we don't necessarily know or trust, but still have to communicate to, is the idea that it's okay, right? It's okay if they make, judgments. It's okay if they misjudge us even. That's not the worst thing in the world, and we still need to have, communicate with those people. And it does put a little bit of pressure on us, though, to try to be as clear with our expectations as possible. And this assertive communication, or this assertive brand of communication, isn't annoying. It's not intrusive. It's not that annoying person that is overconfident or egotistical or arrogant about how they communicate with people and they overtalk, right? That's not what I don't think that's what this article had in mind. I think what the article had in mind was somebody who's more self-aware and genuine about how they communicate. And that's a skill. That's a talent, right, that we can develop over time. All right, so anything from any of the readings or video content, Jonna, that you wanted to share before we kind of move away from the required content for the week? All right. Well, one of the things that I hear often from people is that last one that I put here, which is part of being an assertive communicator is the ability to say no to somebody. A lot of us, especially in a workplace, don't want to ever be put in a situation we feel like we can't say no, right? But reality is, if we never say no, it can become a very negative. It can become a detriment to our relationship with somebody else, right? Every relationship needs boundaries, right? We talk about that all the time with our kids, right? We need to set clear boundaries, and if we communicate clear boundaries, they are able to more effectively operate, right? If we're unclear or vague about our boundaries and about our expectations, then it's much more difficult for them to operate, effectively in, for example, a household or in a family. The same exact concept is true, though, in a workplace, right? If we don't have, even between employee to manager, these different expectation boundaries that we set through our assertive communication, it can get borderline abusive, right? Where they just treat us like a slave, basically, instead of like a colleague, instead of a person, that has value and worth and brings value to the team. It can quickly spin into a situation where, they abuse and use us, right? And we should never be in a workplace situation that it gets to that point. Part of it, though, can be on us, right? We've got to push back sometimes, not in a way that's just trying to be argumentative or just trying to be lazy, not wanting to do things, but also being fair, right? And making sure that we don't get pushed beyond what's reasonable, and what was expected. So anyway, that's an interesting concept that we could explore for quite a while, but something that with family relationships and work relationships, we got to be able to once in a while, not all the time, but once in a while, just put up a barrier, push back a little bit and say no, but do it in a gracious way again. Be able to do it without causing offense or causing problems or some kind of fight. Having said that, one of the books or one of the concepts that I wanted to talk about, and this goes right along with what you just mentioned, Jonna, which is we don't want somebody to, we don't want to not be able to work with somebody or not have that relationship based on how we respond, right? We want to be friends afterward. So how do we do that? How do we have conversations with people in a way that is constructive no matter what the situation is? Even if the situation is fairly negative, even if the situation is kind of confrontational or has a potential to really escalate, how do you take conversations like that in important situations and move them forward and be constructive? And one of the best books out there is a book called Crucial Conversations. It's a consulting firm called Vital Smarts. It's actually located here in Utah County, which is kind of a fun thing because it's nationally renowned. And basically this group, there are 4 or 5 authors on this book called Crucial Conversations, but they basically go into Fortune 500 companies all over the world, and they help executives and they help managerial teams have crucial conversations. And what is a crucial conversation? A crucial conversation is a form of communication that allows something constructive to occur and productive to occur. So you can think about interactions that you have with other people all the time, with family members, with colleagues. A lot of times those conversations become deconstructive, right? They break down, they cause problems, they cause resentment in the future, they cause a fight of some kind, a confrontation. And to these consultants' point, we need to learn as individuals, and if we can master this, it's phenomenally important and constructive. But we need to learn how to take potentially stressful conversations or stressful situations like we talked about earlier and be able to turn them into something very constructive. And it's amazing how what could have been a very negative situation can oftentimes turn into something very, very positive and very, very constructive if it's handled the right way, right? So how do we get productivity out of a workplace or in a family? How do we become more productive as families or in our workplace? And they talk about these crucial conversations being key to that. We have to be able to have these crucial conversations where there's something constructive that's accomplished. We can't avoid, confrontation, conflict. We have to be able to go head on into these conversations and have them. But preparation is key, and how we do them is key. We can't just go around picking fights. That's not what they're referring to. They're trying to say, look, there are going to be disagreements in every single workplace and every single family. There are going to be challenges in every single workplace and every single family. How do we have effective communication around those situations that ends up being constructive? Okay. So we're hardwired to be in a situation where if we feel confrontation, if we feel conflict, that we either go into this, what they refer to as the silence or violence response. Okay. So some of us go into a situation and they'll talk about, an example of a company where you've got a CEO and a CFO, right? And at one point in a board meeting, the CEO and the CFO are kind of interchanging and disagreeing on something. And the CEO basically says, hey, look, I've been in this business 15 years longer than you. I'm the CEO for a reason. And this is why we're going to do this, because you just don't understand, the importance of this situation and the way that I see it. And that's in front of all the board of directors and some other executives. Well, their point is for 5 to 10 years after that, the CFO doesn't offer his opinion to anything. Okay? Just doesn't give an opinion to anything. There's obviously some resentment going on, right? He's highly, he's an effective CFO. He's well qualified. He's got good feedback, and he has a fiduciary responsibility to the company that he represents to give that feedback when there's something that he thinks he should be giving that or he's doing a disservice to the company that he's representing, right, as the chief financial officer. So he's kind of gone into that silence mode, right, where there's some resentment and silence because that conversation that did create some conflict didn't happen how it should have. He got belittled. He got demeaned, right, publicly in front of other people. That conversation didn't happen how it should have, and it created, creates a problem and is a detriment to productivity, right, going forward, because we're not hearing from that CFO. Another example they give is between one of the authors of the book and his son. And basically just a situation like all of us have been in where, son does something, parent gets kind of overreacts because they don't understand the situation. And then when they find out what the situation really is, obviously they feel bad and they should have reacted differently and shouldn't have been so quick to jump to a violence mode, right? And we're not talking violence like hurt our kids, but violence as in tempers get raised, things get said, and even if it's not loud or in a yelling manner, it can be very pointed and can hurt, right? We can create a lot of problems with how we, once again, how we say it. Not what we say, but how we say, the way we say it. So how do we make these crucial conversations constructive? The key is to somehow become more self-aware and somehow train ourselves to have a conversation with ourselves before it escalates to something where we say something we would regret. Now, we all have people in our lives, I think, that we could point to and say, that person seems to be very wise. When they say something, it seems very well thought out. It seems level-headed. It just seems very wise, how they respond to things. Many times that's because it's someone who in a heated moment can keep a level head and can think through things clearly when others aren't able to because of the emotions of the situation. And their comment as far as crucial conversations and kind of mastering this idea of crucial conversations is something we work on our entire lives, and we get better and better at if we're aware, okay? If we're aware of it, which is we always are telling ourselves, even if it's subconsciously, we're always telling ourselves a background story about every single situation. And he gives an example of somebody who says something to the effect of, it's interesting and perhaps negative, something to the effect of it's perhaps negative that so-and-so is now having lunch with their ex-spouse the last 6 months. Okay. So when we hear something like that, and they worded it more eloquently in their example, but when we hear something like that, we subconsciously already jump to a lot of conclusions. Okay. That they've been having lunch, at some nice restaurant and meeting, and that there's more than lunch that's going on if they're starting to have lunch again with their ex-spouse, right? And that's just something that a lot of us subconsciously do. We instead of subconsciously giving anybody the benefit of the doubt, we subconsciously always create kind of a worst case story in our mind. And that worst case story can determine how we react to a situation. So back to our kids, we can be in a situation where we assume that our kids didn't listen to us the 3 times that we told them, or that they didn't, that they're just trying to be disrespectful, or that they're not wanting to do what we asked them to do, or that they're lazy. There's all kinds of stories that we kind of come up with in our minds to add detail to whatever situation we're dealing with. And that story can be the reason that we get amped up or get a lot of emotion or become confrontational or become negative. And many times that story is false, right? It can be true sometimes, right? But many times that story is false. And if we allow that story to control how we react, then we create a problem sometimes that's much bigger than it should have been. So what do? We need to be able to back ourselves away from the story. We need to be able to recreate stories, give people the benefit of the doubt, challenge and change the narrative that our brain automatically created for a situation that we're in. So if we have a colleague that didn't turn in their report, right, for the week, let's say there's a weekly report they're supposed to turn in. They didn't turn it in. Our first thought might be, man, they're just lazy. They're just not doing their work. They should carry their weight. This is making me look bad. There's all kinds of different things that we could get amped up and angered about in our mind before we even know what the real situation is, right? And that's where we need to challenge and change our narrative and perhaps ask in a non-threatening way what the circumstances were of the situation before we jump to conclusions, okay, so that we get the right story. So what do these stories create? They either create a victim of us, a villain out of us, or we create a situation where we feel helpless. And we don't want to feel any one of those three, right? Because our emotions will take over, and sometimes we'll make a situation much worse if we feel like we're the victim, we're getting picked on, they're picking on us, they're doing this to hurt us, they're doing this on purpose, whatever. There's all kinds of things we kind of come up with in our mind, kind of backstory to a situation. Or we paint them as a villain, like they're just evil, right? They're just trying to do this to hurt us. They have bad motivations, they're evil motivations, to try to hurt us, and we're helpless to do anything about it. All three of those usually are lies, that we're expanding a circumstance into all three of those lies, and it's amazing how fast we do it sometimes. Sometimes we do all three almost simultaneously to learning about a situation or seeing a situation, okay? So next time you feel, emotions start to take over, or you feel yourself escalating, a situation or a confrontation, back away from the situation if possible and take a moment to self-assess whether or not you're applying, this victim, villain, helpless situation to the circumstance, and understand and communicate and self-talk to yourself about the fact that you can overcome that. You can change and challenge the situation. Yeah, that's perfect, Jonna, because if you read their book, they talk about how we always, and always is a an exaggeration, right, in and of itself, but we usually exaggerate the circumstance, right? We usually exaggerate the circumstance into something more than what it really is, okay? But we also exaggerate the fact that we're helpless to the situation, right? We're never helpless to a situation. We always can come to some form of constructive, outcome to a situation. Even, and it may be you might have to be very creative about how to make it a constructive situation. There are a lot of very negative confrontational situations that happen at work, in a workplace or in a family. It may take some serious creativity to turn that into a way that we're not helpless, right? We're not a victim, they're not a villain. But it requires us to give somebody the benefit of the doubt. It requires us not to exaggerate a situation. It requires us to start to have a different kind of self-talk that happens. You know what? That is back to self-awareness, Jonna. That's exactly what self-awareness is. It's taking a situation and internalizing the situation, as opposed to, like we talk about, blame, as opposed to, trying to make us a victim or make somebody else a villain. They're quick to say this doesn't obviously eliminate accountability in the situation, right? So Jonna, if you and I are have some kind of confrontation, and you ask yourself, okay, what was your part in the problem, right? Like you did, which is great, because it helps to diffuse, a situation when you're trying to be introspective, right, and look at it. But we have to be careful that we don't cross a line where we start to take blame for something that we really shouldn't either, right? That can be self-destructive. And so there's a line to definitely walk, and we need to hold people accountable for what they do, but we need to communicate in a way that gives them the benefit of the doubt and acknowledges that there's some constructive way to proceed, right? Instead of just blowing up and kind of pulling the adult temper tantrum that happens in a workplace a lot of times, when people can't keep their emotions in check and aren't giving somebody the benefit of the doubt. And then, of course, their message is, crucial conversations. Even though this is meant to be business consulting, it just works in any situation, right? Any relationship that you have can be enhanced by you having better self-talk, by me having better self-talk surrounding a situation, giving people the benefit of the doubt like we know we should, making sure not to exaggerate a situation negatively, even though subconsciously we're kind of hardwired to do that. As soon as we know that subconsciously that's what our brain's always doing, we can do a better job of trying to diffuse some of that and trying to have more constructive communication with others, okay? So I would encourage you, I'm not going to tell you to go buy the Crucial Conversations book, but it is a good read. It is a good exercise, to think about. And it's just something to think about the points that we talked about tonight, the ways that we can kind of get away from being a victim of a situation and making sure that we have some more control of our circumstances and make our conversations more constructive, even if they're stressful. Okay, even if they're hard conversations, they can still be constructive. And some of those hard conversations are the most constructive ones, where it takes a lot of courage to have that conversation. Okay. All right. Another quick bit that I wanted to talk about. This book was written about 80 years ago by Dale Carnegie. How to Win Friends and Influence People. It sounds really corny. John, I don't know if you've ever read it. It's a book that's broken into 4 different parts, and it seems really intuitive, right? These things are all things that we, that it's like, yeah, of course, that's how it is. But most of us don't think about it enough, or worry about it enough, or consider it enough, or prepare with this information enough to actually effectively communicate in the way that this book can help us communicate. And I've got a long ways to go. It's one of these things where you learn about these concepts, you think, oh yeah, I can do a little bit better at that, and then you get kind of stuck doing the normal routine, right? So the more aware we are, once again, the more we can try to implement some of these things. But Dale Carnegie breaks his book down into 4 parts. It's a very famous book, millions and millions of copies, for a good reason. It's got some very good points about how to communicate, mostly in a business setting, okay, but it would work and be applicable to any kind of communication that we have. So first section is alignment. And what he talks about in the first section is that to make sure that if you want to be an effective communicator, you've got to align how you're communicating and what you're communicating with the needs of who you're talking to. Okay. And he talks about, just gives the really simple example of fishing. We can decide that we really like ice cream. We enjoy ice cream. We enjoy the treats that we like. Our audience, which in the case of fishing or the fish, they don't want anything to do with ice cream. If we put a donut or a treat or ice cream on a hook, we probably wouldn't get anything, right? They want bait. They want the bait. And so the concept is oversimplified, but the idea is really profound, and that is, if you are trying to communicate an idea or concept to, for example, people who you work with, you have got to find out what their needs are. You've got to find out. You've got to know what their needs really are. And then you've got to communicate whatever it is you're trying to accomplish to align with their needs. And let me give you a quick example from my workplace. My workplace, I work with partners in a bank, that tellers and bankers. Their needs are manyfold, but 2 of the most important needs that bankers and tellers have, one is to get paid, right? They need to get paid. So that's something that I can align with, because in my world, if they refer to me, I can pay them, right? So it doesn't have to be about me and what I'm trying to accomplish. It can be about what they're trying to accomplish that still helps me out. So I can help train them on how to refer people to me. But the point of that, as far as they're concerned, is to make a few bucks, right? And I'm going to help them do that. Another issue that they have is that they don't want to ever feel like they don't have the answers, right? They want to feel like they're confident about what they're doing and about their job, and that they can have conversations with people that don't make them uncomfortable throughout the day, because they have to have conversations all the time with people, and they want to feel confident about what they're doing. So me being able to train and coach them on ways to say things and practice ways to say things can make them more confident. I can also simplify the message that they're communicating to people on my behalf. So if I say, okay, we want to make you some extra money, here's how you do it to get referrals, I need to look for these kind of people, then we can go a step further and practice a very simple way to communicate that my services exist, and then to be able to communicate that I'll be in touch with them. And by doing that, I make their job easier, right? More simplified, and something that they can feel confident about because of our practice and because of that training. If I do it right, right? I don't always do it right, but if I do it right, it's going to be simple. It's going to be aligned with what they're trying to accomplish each and every day, having decent conversations with people that they can be confident about, but then also making a few extra bucks. Does that make sense? So we're trying to align our who we're communicating to, we need to align with their needs, whatever we're communicating. If we can't align with their needs, what we have to say is never going to be meaningful, to them. Got to line up with what their needs are. We've also got to have a genuine interest in them, okay? This is another thing that happens a lot of times in a workplace. A lot of employees many times feel like the interest that they get from their superior, their manager, their manager's manager is kind of, it's just not genuine, right? They might ask, oh, what did you do this last week? And they're not even really listening to what we're saying. They just are trying to make talk, right? Make conversation. Or it's kind of the politician effect, right? You meet a politician and they just immediately act like they care. But for some of us, that just feels really superficial and it just doesn't feel genuine. And his point in this is that deeply rooted friendships based on you showing genuine interest motivate. Okay, a deeply rooted friendship between colleagues, between employees, between managers and their employees, between people in a family, right? Those tend to motivate us to do and to work on each other's behalf, right? And if you want a strong team, right, you have deeply rooted friendships. That creates that team, and then we're all more productive, right? And that's his point. So showing genuine interest, and key on genuine, right? We need to make sure that we're being genuine, which takes practice sometimes to do. We also admit wrongs, and he something very interesting that he goes into is that how emphatic we need to be about what we've done wrong. So if we find that we've made a mistake, and they do the example of a bank teller, not balancing a drawer, having money missing, instead of waiting for the manager to find out, instead of the manager coming and accusing us of that, having to wait for that, we are the proactive one. We admit the mistake, and not only do we admit the mistake, but we admit the mistake emphatically, meaning, oh, I made this huge mistake. I just feel horrible about it. I don't know that I don't even know if I should, if I can even work here, is the example that they give, just way over the top in how emphatic we are about our mistake. And what that does is it draws the poison from whomever, we're dealing with, and they'll probably take the opposite side. They want the best for us, right? Most people subconsciously want the best for us, but if they feel like we're trying to justify doing something wrong or doing something that we shouldn't have or making a mistake, which mistakes are going to happen, right? Every workplace, every family, we're going to have mistakes. But if we can own up to them and admit wrongs emphatically, it's an amazing tool, because it takes, like I say, the poison and the emotion out of that situation. And then a lot of times it turns into a very different kind of situation where they're trying to act consoling and constructive instead of upset and accusatory. Okay? So just an interesting concept. One of the things that he's very careful to say is don't defend yourself. Don't justify your behavior. Maybe that you might be asked, what was the reason, or what happened, and that's an opportunity for you to maybe explain yourself, but don't defend and get defensive about your situation or about what happened. That just never works, right? We want somebody to own up to what they did. We want somebody to feel bad for what they did, and then we want to move on, right? But if somebody's defensive about what they did and tries to justify it, sometimes we can't feel like we can move on, right? It makes it much harder for us to move on. So just something that we've probably dealt with a lot of times in life, but maybe we haven't thought about why that happens. Yeah, and Jonna, this is an interesting concept too, because I think it plays out in politics all the time. When we have politicians that make mistakes and come out and just say, this is what I did, I feel horrible, this was a terrible mistake, I won't do it again, that kind of release, or press release of some kind, with that kind of situation, a lot of times people are quick to forgive them and we move on, right? But if we find out about something that they didn't come forward with, boy, we have a hard time, right? I mean, that's just a totally different situation when they weren't upfront about it, and then we find out, they get caught, and then they feel bad, and then they try to rationalize or justify what they did. Then it's really hard to move on. It's really hard to forgive them for stuff like that, right? So I totally agree, Jonah. The fourth segment of his book, he talks about how we help people change without giving offense or creating resentment. And this goes back to that crucial conversations. I mean, these all tie together, right? Always talk about your own mistakes first. Always try to take the situation, where you're trying to be corrective or constructive with somebody else and make it something personal with you first, right? Before you suggest, changes in someone else. It's just a much more effective way of doing that. And so, for example, if I'm a manager of somebody at a bank and I notice that they're having a hard time selling a certain product that they need to be selling, right? So I need to hold them accountable to that. They need to be selling that product. They work at the bank and the bank expects them to sell that. First of all, I'd be anxious to find out what the situation is and try to, show some empathy about what they're trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish, what they feel like their challenges are. And then I'd be very quick as a manager to demonstrate that I've had my own challenges as a manager in helping, people to get those sales, and then being open to suggestions on how we can improve and how we can do it differently. Okay. So it just takes it away from being accusatory, confrontational, negative, really negative, where it's somebody harping or berating, to get something that they want accomplished. And it turns it into something where, hey, we're all working at this together. We all have mistakes. We all have challenges. Here's some things that I did, when I had a similar challenge. What do you think? What do you think? What can we do? And just be open to suggestions and ways to improve without always trying to fix problems for people and just going after them, right? So anyway, 4 main components or parts of that book by Dale Carnegie. If you haven't read it, it's a quick read, John, and anybody else that's listening. I think it's a very, very good tool and reminder about effective ways of communication. Fits right along with what we're talking about. Okay. All right, so we're almost out of time tonight, and I had a few other things that I wanted to cover, but maybe the last one we'll end with is Covey. So Covey, Stephen R. Covey, years ago wrote a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and basically about half of these habits have to do with communication, right, and effectively communicating with others. So one of the communication tips that I think is very good, one of these 7 habits, is how in our conversations, in our interactions, to think of every situation as a win-win situation, so that it's not us going into a situation and and this is hard for some people, and I'm included in this. I really struggle sometimes to not look at every situation as kind of an absolute win-lose circumstance where if I win more, then they lose more, and if they win more, then I'm somehow losing more, right? And that dynamic gets me in trouble sometimes because I don't look at situations like I should, which is, we both should be able to win from this, right? It's not about one of us trying to get the upper edge. It's about both of us being able to once again have a constructive situation where we both feel like we're getting something from it and both winning. And it's not one person outdoing the other. It's not competitive, like I sometimes get caught up in thinking things are competitive all the time. It's not that way. It's the only way that we can truly have a good team approach, and it's the only way that we can truly have a good sales process in any form, right? Our sales process has to be about both of us getting something that we're looking for, right, and fulfilling needs of both of us. The same is true for conversations that we have. We need to look at those conversations like we talked about last week with one of the articles, that it's not we're not trying to come up with our next argument, trying to come up with a way to insert ourselves or assert what our ideas are. That's not the point of any conversation. The point of a conversation is to come to understanding, like we keep talking about. And we can't do that if we're trying to win, instead of having a win-win situation. So I think that's a great tip from Covey, and a highly effective tip, just like he says in having good relationships with people and also communicating effectively. One of his tips is to seek first to understand, then to be understood. We've talked about this a lot, right, in this class. We want to make sure and validate people's feelings and understand them before we come up with solutions, and maybe we shouldn't even come up with solutions in some circumstances, right? But we need to listen carefully to what someone's saying, make sure and validate their concerns, validate their perspective, and only then perhaps change to a situation where we even share ours, right? And get into that, so switch from the giving to the receiving, like that other article talked about. But seek first to be understood, or excuse me, to understand. Yeah, don't be understood first. Seek to understand first. And then finally, sharpen the saw. And this is the last tip that he gives in the book. Talks a lot about creating habits and improving yourself, so self-improvement. Communication is one of those things, and we've talked about it before, Jonna, that it just takes practice, right? We've just got to do it. We've just got to try it. We've got to make mistakes sometimes, and we've got to keep getting up and trying some more. I mentioned, my own kind of story, my backstory, which is that, man, I was terrified of speaking in front of anybody, and it just gave me the worst fear and negative feelings, to do it. Just so much angst inside about communicating in front of people. And then as I did it more and more and more and practiced and tried to push myself through, some of that anxiety, you get to a point where you really enjoy, not necessarily speaking in front of strangers, but you enjoy being able to communicate and effectively relay your thoughts and feelings, right? There is something satisfying about kind of what we talked about in one of the other articles that talks about assertive communication. When you can confidently and clearly communicate what it is that you want somebody to understand, or to demonstrate that you understand what somebody else said, and show empathy and sympathy. So that's a skill. It's definitely something we all can work at, right? But that's kind of the sharpen the saw. It's just get a little better at this. Try something every day, to become a little bit better at it, and we'll all get a lot better, right, Jonna? We can. Your style of communication and writing is excellent. You're an excellent writer. That probably is from a lot of practice and a lot of communication that way. I don't know as much, Jonna, because you and I haven't had a face-to-face conversation, or I haven't had you in front of a crowd, trying to communicate your ideas. I don't know how that would be, right? But all of us can get a little bit better at all the forms of communication we have, and this whole idea of being a good listener and somebody that is good at validating other people's thoughts and feelings, and then is great at having constructive, crucial conversations is just, I think, such a great life skill. I think it could take us so much further, than we even think is possible for ourselves. And I'll just wrap it up with that thought. And have a great week this week, Jonna. Thank you so much for being here again. We will reconvene next week, same time. And that'll be the last class. So we're, like I say, halfway through, and sure appreciate you, like I say, and we'll look forward to visiting with you next week. Thanks.